The chamber was already electric before the first word was spoken. Reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder, cameras trained like rifles, waiting for history to trip over itself. On one side of the table sat Donald Trump, his jaw set, his tie blaring red like a warning siren. He wasn't president anymore, but he carried himself as if power still bent around him like gravity. Across from him, Denzel Washington sat calm, composed, no entourage, no theatrics. Just a single manila folder resting in front of him, pages heavy with receipts, facts, testimonies. The silence felt like the hush before a storm. Then Trump leaned into the microphone, his grin sharp, his voice louder than it needed to be. "This country doesn't need Hollywood lectures," he sneered. "It needs strength, not scripts." The words dropped like stones, calculated, meant to cut. A ripple of chuckles came from his side, aides shifting in satisfaction. But Denzel didn't blink, he didn't fidget, he let the insult hang, absorbing its weight like a boxer waiting for the real punch. And then, in a voice low and measured, he answered, not with fire, not with fury, but with something sharper. "Strength," he said. His eyes lifted, locking on Trump's. "Strength isn't screaming. Strength isn't building walls around fear. Real strength is lifting people when it costs you something." The chamber stirred. Pens scratched paper. Trump smirked, ready to unleash more. But for the first time, the cameras pivoted, not to the man who had always commanded the room, but to the man who had just redrawn its center. Words had been drawn like weapons. And the duel had begun. The hearing room felt primed for combustion, mahogany gleam, flags still as held breath, cameras stacked like artillery along the back wall. Trump entered first, jaw set, red tie blazing, the old rally swagger compressed into a courtroom stride. He didn't look at the judge, he looked at the lenses. Across the aisle, Denzel Washington stepped in with no entourage, a plain manila folder under his arm, posture easy but unyielding, as if he'd trained his whole life to carry complicated truths without dropping a single one. Reporters stopped whispering, even the clock seemed to tick softer. Trump leaned into the mic before anyone invited him. "America doesn't need Hollywood lectures," he said, voice pitched to travel. "It needs strength, not scripts." A few loyal chuckles, the faint clatter of a pen cap. Denzel didn't blink. He laid the folder down, squared it with the table's edge, then raised his eyes like a curtain lifting. "Strength," he said, calm enough to carry. "Strength isn't how loud you break a room. It's how steady you hold it together, especially when it costs you." The line didn't land like applause bait, it landed like a level. The judge's gaze sharpened. Trump's smirk thinned. Denzel slid a page free. "These are incident logs, dates, towns, hospital admits, spikes that followed your speeches almost to the hour. You call it passion. The people in these pages call it stitches." He didn't perform the words, he set them down. A quiet shiver moved through the gallery. Trump rolled his shoulders, searching for the old rhythm. "People are angry because I told the truth," he shot back. Denzel nodded once. "Anger can be a warning light. You turned it into a road map." He let the silence widen, then pinned it with a look. "We're not here to grade your volume, sir. We're here to measure your impact." Pens began to race. The judge tapped his gavel, not to scold, but to mark the moment. For years, Trump had written the scene by speaking first. Today, the narrative shifted without raising a voice. Words were drawn like weapons. And for the first time, his weren't the sharpest in the room. Trump leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like a barricade, his jaw tightening with every second of silence. He hated silence more than defeat, because silence meant someone else controlled the room. He leaned toward the mic again, trying to reassert himself. "You don't get it, Denzel. People don't want lectures. They want strength. They want walls. They want protection." His words punched through the air, rehearsed, familiar. But Denzel didn't flinch. He turned slightly toward the gallery, his voice carrying past Trump, speaking to the people, not the man in front of him. "Strength without mercy isn't strength, it's fear in disguise. And protection? He let the word hang for a moment. Protection doesn't mean building higher walls. It means making sure no one needs to climb them in the first place. A murmur spread across the room, the kind that comes when a truth too sharp to ignore slices through the noise. Trump shifted again, his face flushing. He slammed his hand against the desk. Wrong, he snapped. I protected jobs. I protected borders. I protected this country from chaos. Denzel rose from his seat now, unfolding to his full height, his calm presence amplified. No, Mr. Trump, he said, his voice steady but undeniable. You didn't protect America from chaos. You profited from it. You fed it. And then you pointed fingers at the fire while selling tickets to the blaze. The chamber erupted, not in cheers, not in jeers, but in something deeper, the sound of people gasping when they recognize a line that will be replayed for decades. Phones rose into the air, cameras zoomed closer, the judge's gavel struck twice but the sound barely registered. Trump leaned forward, eyes narrow, his grin finally gone. Careful, he warned, his voice low, dangerous. You don't know the storm you're inviting. Denzel's eyes locked onto his. Maybe not, he said, quiet but razor sharp. But I do know storms don't scare people who've already lived through the flood. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder, the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like a battlefield wrapped in oak and marble. The audience leaned forward as though the next sentence could tip history itself. Trump, red-faced and restless, jabbed a finger across the room. You sit there pretending to speak for the people, but you don't know them. I walked into factories, I shook hands with miners, I gave them hope. His voice cracked at the edges, desperation blending with defiance. Denzel didn't sit back down. He planted his hands on the desk in front of him, voice calm but cutting, each word a scalpel. You gave them slogans, Donald. You gave them chance to drown out their fears. But hope? Real hope doesn't end when the rally's over. Real hope isn't about making them cheer, it's about making sure they can feed their families when the cheering stops. The judge looked torn, gavel hovering, but even he couldn't silence the storm brewing. Trump smirked, trying to recover ground. And what did you give them, Denzel? Hollywood speeches? Fancy words? You think poetry pays the rent? His supporters in the room chuckled nervously, desperate for a win. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. No. But honesty does. And dignity, and leadership that doesn't feed on division like a parasite. You call it strength, but strength doesn't come from making enemies out of neighbors. It comes from knowing when to listen, even to voices you don't like. The chamber shifted. Some people who had laughed moments ago now sat in uneasy silence. A woman in the back row whispered, "He's right," and others nodded faintly, almost afraid to agree out loud. Trump slammed the table again, louder this time. You don't belong here. You're not a politician. His voice echoed with fury. Denzel finally leaned closer, his eyes locked on Trump's with surgical precision. Maybe that's why people are listening. The room exhaled all at once, a release of tension so sharp it left goosebumps behind. Cameras flashed. Headlines practically wrote themselves. The silence after Denzel's words was deafening, almost suffocating. Even the shuffling of papers, the coughs, the whispers, gone. Trump sat frozen for a split second, then laughed, a hollow sound that didn't quite mask the crack in his armor. People don't want lectures, Denzel. They want results. They want walls, safety, jobs. Not philosophy lessons. But the laughter didn't spread. It died in the stale air, as if the room itself refused to echo it. Denzel turned, not to Trump, but to the people watching, citizens, journalists, everyday Americans packed into the courtroom like history's spectators. His voice was steady, sharp, deliberate. Results? Let's talk about results. You built walls, but did they keep families together? You gave speeches about safety, but did you keep children safe in their schools? You boasted about jobs, but tell me, What good is a paycheck if dignity is stripped away in the process? What good is work when truth itself becomes expendable? His words weren't shouted. They were anchored, carried with the kind of weight that made people sit straighter in their seats. Trump shifted, jaw tightening, eyes darting to his attorneys as if searching for backup. None came. Then Denzel delivered the blow, the line that cut through the chamber like glass shattering on stone. You confuse control with leadership, Donald. But control builds fear. Leadership builds trust. And America is starving for trust. The audience erupted, not with applause, but with gasps, murmurs, the sound of something breaking loose inside people's minds. Some scribbled furiously in notebooks. Others lifted their phones, desperate to capture the moment. A storm was brewing, and everyone knew it. Trump tried to smirk, but the tremor in his lips betrayed him. The cameras caught it all. This wasn't just an argument. It was a reckoning, and the crowd could feel it in their bones. Trump leaned back in his chair, lips pursed, trying to look unfazed. But his knuckles were white against the polished wood of the table. He raised his chin and fired back with his trademark bravado. You talk a lot about dignity, Denzel, but that's easy when you're rich, when you're famous. You don't know what it's like to be forgotten in your own country. I gave those people a voice. The line landed, but weakly, like a punch thrown in slow motion. Denzel didn't flinch. Instead, he paused, allowing Trump's words to linger in the air just long enough for their hollowness to become obvious. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate, the kind of tone that made people lean in, afraid to miss a single syllable. You didn't give them a voice, Donald. You gave them an echo. You amplified their fears, turned their pain into fuel for your power. And when the crowd went home, when the chants faded, what did they have left? Broken promises and deeper wounds. The crowd stirred. A man in the front row whispered, "That's true," and his voice carried just enough to be picked up by a nearby mic. Trump's face reddened. He slammed his hand on the table again. You don't get it. They loved me. They still do. Denzel's reply was surgical. Love built on fear isn't love, it's dependency. And one day, Donald, when the fear stops working, the people you used will walk away. And history won't remember the noise. It will remember the damage. The judge's gavel struck once, then twice, but even he seemed powerless against the current running through the room. Phones buzzed, cameras zoomed in, and hashtags were already being born in real time. This wasn't just theater. It was testimony, etched straight into the American conscience. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now, charged with something beyond politics. Trump shifted in his chair, tugging at his tie, the familiar mask of confidence cracking under the weight of eyes fixed on him. He tried to reset, leaning toward the mic with a forced grin. You know, Hollywood types love to lecture. They've got scripts, makeup, cameras to make them look perfect. But out here it's real. I dealt with real people, real problems, not lines written for applause. Laughter, scattered and uncertain, rippled through the gallery. But it wasn't the kind that bolstered him. It was uneasy, a nervous release that betrayed doubt. Denzel didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze toward Trump, steady as stone. His voice, calm but cutting, sliced through the room. You think this is about cameras, Donald? About applause? No. This is about the stage you built, the one where anger replaced answers, where division became policy, where cruelty was dressed up as strength. That's the show you put on. And people are still paying for the ticket. The silence that followed was dense, suffocating. Even the reporters hesitated to type. Trump opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, his rhythm deserted him. Denzel leaned back, his presence unshaken, his words echoing louder than any shout could have. You keep talking about what's real. Well, here's reality. when leaders choose fear over truth, it's the people who bleed. Not you. The room erupted, not with cheers, not yet, but with the unmistakable murmur of recognition. It was the sound of a truth too sharp to ignore. By now, the cameras weren't just recording, they were hunting, zooming in on every twitch, every bead of sweat. The nation was watching, split screens on every channel, hashtags flooding the internet. Trump straightened in his chair, voice rising. You talk about fear, Denzel, but fear keeps people safe. Fear builds walls, keeps the dangerous out. Without it, this country would fall apart. You call it cruelty, I call it survival. His words boomed, bouncing against the oak-paneled walls, meant to rally, to dominate. But the energy didn't land, it scattered, heavy and brittle. Denzel inhaled slowly, his expression calm, unshaken. He leaned forward, folding his hands like a man who didn't need volume to command attention. Fear doesn't build walls, Donald. Fear builds cages. And cages don't protect, they suffocate. They don't keep danger out, they trap people inside. Fear isn't leadership. It's manipulation. And the cruelest part? You knew it. You counted on it. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Trump's jaw clenched, his orange-tinted face tightening as he searched for a comeback. But Denzel didn't stop. His voice softened, which only made the words strike harder. Real survival doesn't come from making people smaller, weaker, quieter. It comes from giving them the tools to stand, to grow, to rise. You turned neighbors into enemies, Donald. You called it patriotism. But the truth? You were never protecting America. You were protecting yourself. The judge's gavel cracked again, but it couldn't drown out the reaction. The crowd was stirring now, louder, a wave building. Phones rose higher, the world outside swelling with anticipation of the clip that was already being carved into history. Trump's face darkened, his voice now a mix of anger and desperation. He slammed the table with his palm, leaning toward the microphone. You think you're some kind of hero, Denzel? You sit up there, judging me, but without me, this country would have been overrun. I gave people hope. I made America strong again. The words echoed, but they didn't soar. They fell heavy, almost pleading, a shadow of the bravado that once filled stadiums. The audience shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, others stared with morbid fascination, waiting to see if the giant could recover. Denzel didn't move right away. He let the silence grow until even Trump seemed to flinch under it. Then, in a voice so steady it felt unshakable, he spoke. Strength isn't measured by how many people fear you, Donald. It's measured by how many people trust you. And right now, trust is the one thing you've lost. A murmur swept across the room, stronger this time, undeniable. Trump opened his mouth, but Denzel pressed on, his tone sharper, his words deliberate. Hope isn't built on rallies or slogans. It's built on action, compassion, accountability. You promised greatness, but left division. You promised safety, but fed chaos. And now you sit here, calling it strength, when all it ever was weakness dressed as power. The crowd reacted audibly now, a mix of gasps and applause, raw and unscripted. Even the judge leaned back, lips pressed together, as if realizing this hearing had spiraled into something larger than legal testimony. Trump sat frozen, chest heaving, but no words came. For the first time, silence had chosen him. The courtroom had turned into something beyond its walls, part stage, part battleground, part history book being written in real time. The tension no longer felt like silence, it felt like a pulse, beating through every spectator, every reporter, every camera lens broadcasting to millions. Trump sat rigid, eyes darting, mouth tight, but his usual arsenal of comebacks had run dry. Denzel remained still, his calm presence only magnifying the storm that had already been unleashed. Then, in the kind of voice that didn't shout but carried further than thunder, Denzel delivered the final blow. You can shout about walls, about fear, about strength all you want. But leaders don't divide their people, they carry them. They don't inflame chaos, they calm it. They don't leave a nation bleeding, they help it heal. And history, Donald, history won't remember the noise. It will remember who built trust, who lifted people higher, and who left them smaller. The words landed like a gavel heavier than the judge's. For a moment, the room froze. Then came the eruption, cheers, claps, even tears from some who had lived through the chaos Denzel described. Reporters scrambled to send headlines. Clips of this moment would flood every platform within minutes, tagged, retagged, memed, dissected. Trump sat back, hands gripping the armrests, his face pale beneath the spray-tan glow. He looked smaller, not because Denzel had shouted him down, but because he hadn't needed to. Denzel leaned back at last, blazer smooth, eyes steady. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He had spoken, and the weight of truth hung heavier than any applause. The nation outside would debate, argue, spin, but the people inside this room knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. It wasn't a clash. It was a reckoning. This wasn't just a debate. It was a mirror held up to an era. Denzel's calm but cutting words cut through the noise Trump had built for years. And now the real question is, who will America stand with? The noise, or the truth?